All right, so we're going to be talking today about nutrients involved in bone health. And we're going to take a few seconds to go over bones and the different parts of bones so that we can understand how these nutrients are going to help us to keep nice, strong, healthy bones. So as you know, you have different shapes of bones. You have long bones, you have short bones, you have irregular bones. And what we're seeing in this picture here, this is a long bone. And the shaft of the bone is what we refer to as the diaphysis of the bone. And then the ends of the bone are the epiphysis. Okay, so we have an epiphysis here, or you call them together an epiphyses. And in each epiphysis, you have what's referred to as trabecular bone. And this trabecular bone is also called spongy bone. So you can see it has what it looks like, sponge material in there. It's not quite as dense. It's kind of an open lattice type of structure. And then you have down the shaft or the diaphysis of the bone, you have a hollow region, which is your bone marrow. And spongy tissue in flat bones and trabecular bones help to fill this bone marrow also. And the bone marrow contains stem cells. Now, depending on the bone, some of this bone marrow can also produce red blood cells. So you have red bone marrow and you have yellow bone marrow. Now, the red bone marrow is helping to produce the red blood cells. The yellow bone marrow is actually fat, and the fat is there for the health and the energy of the bone. You also have cortical bone, and this is also referred to as compact bone or dense bone. It's found on the outer layers of the bone, and it helps to keep the bone very, very strong. The bones are covered by a connective tissue layer called the periosteum, and the periosteum also contains stem cells. Now, these stem cells in the periosteum, they help to produce the cells that help to take care of bone, and we'll talk about each of those cells as we go along. So bone growth and remodeling, our bones are constantly being pulled apart or degraded, and new bone is growing all the time. So what your skeleton looks like today is not what it's going to look like a year from now. And it really depends on the type of job that you do, the way you sit, the way you stand, that type of thing. So if you're always hunching down, your bones can reshape and reform for that. Or if you're always leaning to one side because of a certain job, your bones can reform to basically help you out to be able to reach further. Now, in this bone growth and remodeling, we have certain types of cells. So we have a cell called an osteoclast. And this osteoclast is a cell that helps to break down or degrade the bone over time. And so we have what's called resorption of the bone. And so that's losing certain substances in the bone in order to be able to remodel or grow the bone. And then we have osteoblasts, and these are your bone cells that actually grow or synthesize the bone. Now, your bone is made up of different chemicals, and some of these chemicals are there to give the bone that density and strength. And your bone is a type of connective tissue. Now, in order for something to be a connective tissue, there have to be cells in that connective tissue, and there has to be something called a matrix or ground substance, and a hydroxyapatite is that ground substance, and it has certain fibers in it, like proteins, like collagen, and then it also has other types of minerals in it like calcium and phosphorus and fluoride, and these help to give strength to the bone. Osteocytes, these are your mature bone cells. So the osteoblast will become an osteocyte over time, because the way the bone cells work is kind of interesting. They kind of sit in the middle, and then what they do is they produce bone all around themselves, and they surround themselves over and over with a denser and denser layer of bone until eventually these osteoblasts get stuck in the middle of all of this bone that they have laid down or grown around them, and they can't move anymore. And so now they can't do any more growing of bone because they've grown all that they can, and we now refer to this osteoblast as an osteocyte. So an osteogenic cell is the stem cell. And remember, we've talked about stem cells. These are cells that are able to turn into any type of cell in the human body. And so you have this osteogenic cell that can then turn into an osteoblast and over time turn into an osteocyte. And so these are the osteoblasts around the edge of the bone. This is compact bone, and the osteoblasts are producing more bone. These are the osteocytes that have laid the bone down around them. Same thing here. These are representing osteocytes where the bone has grown. You can see stem cells can also turn into osteoclasts. And here's the periosteum under the surface of the bone, and your osteoclast is going around kind of like a little Pac-Man, and it is eating up that bone for remodeling purposes. So with bone mineral density, this is important for you to understand. This is the total mineral content of bone at a specific bone site divided by the width of the bone at that site. So we want to measure bone mineral density on a number of occasions. So one is we can look at younger children as their bones are growing to see how dense the bone is and how well it's growing. But mainly we look at this in the elderly, and we're going to talk about this as well when we start to talk about osteoporosis. What is their bone mineral density? And generally we measure this in grams per cubic centimeter. So bone is composed approximately of 65% minerals, 35% connective tissue. Peak bone mass is achieved by age of 30. So the density of your bone and the weight of your bone is going to be the greatest at around the age of 30. After that, you start to slowly lose bone density. Now, that can be prevented a little bit, and we'll talk about that as well. Bone resorption occurs at a rate faster than bone synthesis after the age of 30, and it leads to decrease in bone mass and, of course, bone mineral density. So these are some of the factors associated with how healthy your bone is. So for instance, women have lower bone mass and density than men, and we'll talk about why. We already said bone loss occurs after the age of 30. Individuals of Caucasian or Asian heritage are of much greater risk to have poor bone health than, let's say, of African descent. And people with smaller bones have lower bone mass, and they also have greater risk of osteoporosis later on in life. And women at menopause and then even after menopause, they can have a lot of problems with their bones because their estrogen levels fall. And again, we'll talk about all of that. So some of the important things we have to know is even though we're losing bone mass after the age of 30, we can lose it slower. And we can make sure even before the age of 30 that bone mass is thicker and more dense. So these are some of the things we need to talk about. So one of the important things, of course, is good nutrition, and a diet rich in fruits and vegetables, grains and lean proteins are very important. Maintaining a healthy body weight is important because a person who is too thin or a person who is obese is going to put a lot of stress on the bones. Now, we'll talk about both of those, but just let's say a person who's too thin, for instance. One of the important things about bone is that you have to have the right amount of calcium in the bone to keep that bone nice and strong. And if I don't have enough weight on my body, then I might have to remove some of that calcium from the bone to provide to my other cells. because the lack of that weight could be due to poor nutrition. And I don't want to have to leach calcium from the bone all the time in order to supply this to the rest of my body. And of course, a person having a normal menses, it's very important for that to happen, because that tells us we have the right amount of estrogen and the right amount of progesterone floating around in the blood, and that keeps our bones nice and healthy as well. Weight bearing and physical activity, we're going to talk about that a little bit more, but that is very important. And then not smoking, because smoking lowers estrogen levels in the blood. Moderate intake of phosphorus, sodium, caffeine, wheat bran, and alcohol. All of these leach particular minerals from bone. So for instance, where we get phosphorus from would be like diet sodas or any type of cola type sodas. Brown sodas have a lot of phosphorus. Phosphorus removes calcium from the bone, and so it's not a good idea to be drinking these colas all the time. And then certain medications can cause problems with the bone as well. Sunlight exposure, very important. We're going to talk about why, in particular, vitamin D production and its effects with calcium and how that interacts in the body. So in order to increase bone density, so let's talk about before the age of 30. One of the things that really NASA was able to show is that gravity assists in bone density, okay, in increasing bone density. So for instance, if I do any type of anti-gravity exercises, which basically means I lift a weight, I pick up trash bags to take them to the trash, I push a lawn mower, anything that's going against gravity is actually pulling on my skeletal muscles, and those skeletal muscles are pulling on the bone. Now, when skeletal muscles pull on bone, this actually causes or triggers bone growth, and osteoblasts are triggered to lay down more of that matrix, more of that hydroxyapatite in order to have thicker bones. And the reason I say NASA was helpful in all of this is because when you had astronauts go into space for longer than a couple of weeks, what they found is over time their bone density decreased amazingly, so that when they got back to Earth and got back to a gravity situation, some of these astronauts, their bones were so weak that their bones would start to crack as they walked on Earth. And so this is why now they have these gravity chambers inside the space stations and all. All right, so functions of calcium. Calcium makes up 40% of all minerals in the body, and it helps in bone growth and development, maintenance of that bone density, and 99% of calcium in the body is used to strengthen bones as well as teeth. But calcium has other functions, and if you don't have enough calcium, you can't form blood clots, muscle contraction, neurons can't go through the action potentials and contractions. I mean, there's all kinds of things that calcium helps us to do. As a matter of fact, every single cell in your body is dependent on calcium. If you don't have enough calcium, you're in big trouble. So one of the nice things is that your body has a really good storage place for calcium, and you have plenty of it, which is in the skeletal system. So if I'm not eating enough calcium in my diet every day, not a problem. My cells are going to go after that calcium in the skeletal system. And so we have a way to regulate calcium levels if I need it in the rest of the body. So this is where the parathyroid gland comes into play. So you know you have the thyroid gland, but sitting right behind the thyroid gland are four little teeny tiny glands, which are the parathyroid glands. So this is looking at the back side. Here's the esophagus here, the trachea, and then this is the thyroid, and these little tiny things right here, these are the parathyroid glands, and of course they secrete parathyroid hormone. Now, parathyroid hormone is going to come into play when I don't have enough calcium in my blood. So if I have low calcium levels, this stimulates the parathyroid glands to release parathyroid hormone, or PTH. Now, the job of parathyroid hormone is to then stimulate osteoclasts. You know that osteoclasts are the cells that reabsorb bone. And so what's going to happen is those osteoclasts are going to go through the bone and chew up the bone, and it's going to release calcium into the bloodstream from the bone. The other thing that parathyroid hormone does is it also works in the small intestine, and it increases absorption of calcium from the small intestine. However, for that absorption of calcium to occur, you have to also have two other chemicals involved in absorbing calcium from the food that enters into your small intestine. You have to have estrogen and you have to have vitamin D. So it's a combination of those three hormones: PTH, parathyroid hormone, estrogen, and vitamin D, so that you can get the appropriate absorption of calcium from your small intestine. So blood calcium levels, of course, are very tightly regulated so that we don't have to have any kind of calcium deficiency in the blood. Because think about this, it is regulating your neurons, and it's regulating your muscles, and it's regulating hormone secretion, and these are all absolutely necessary. And if you don't have enough calcium, then these cells are not going to be able to function, which means if neurons in your brain can't function, you don't exist anymore. So we know that calcium is going to be hormonally controlled. We talked about parathyroid hormone so that we can increase calcium release from the bone, increase absorption from the gut. And then also, instead of the kidneys filtering calcium out of the blood, that slows down. We don't have as much filtering of calcium from the blood into the urine. If all of these things are not taken care of, we're going to have a calcium deficiency. So this is why having healthy parathyroid hormone, making sure we have enough estrogen, enough vitamin D is very, very important. So the recommended daily allowance of calcium is about 1,000 milligrams per day for adults up to the age of 50 and 1,200 milligrams for adults 51 and over. The average American only takes in about 800 milligrams per day for women, 1,000 milligrams per day for men. So we're a little bit deficient on our calcium levels. However, there have been a few studies done to say, should we consume extra calcium to make sure we have really nice, dense muscles? And the answer to that is absolutely not, because taking too much calcium in our diet is going to cause problems as well, such as kidney stones. That's a really big issue. And some people can consume so much calcium that you actually get calcium deposits underneath the skin and in internal organs, and this is not good at all. So rules of 300 are used to estimate calcium intake. So 300 milligrams for food consumed throughout the day, 300 milligrams for each cup of milk, and any kind of calcium fortified beverages like orange juice, for instance, tofu, almonds. So this just is showing you the amount of calcium that we should be taking in yellow here, and the amount we actually do take in green for men and in blue for women. So we're pretty deficient. So the upper limit is 2,500 milligrams of calcium a day, and you have to be careful because excess calcium can also cause bloating, gas, constipation, and then that risk of kidney stones we talked about. It could lead to headaches, a lot of it kidney failure. We talked about tissue calcification, and then decreased absorption of other minerals as well. All right, so calcium absorption is increased by your need. So if I have a high need, such as during a growth spurt or pregnancy or lactation, then I'm going to release signals in the body to increase absorption of calcium. And then those signals can be high levels of parathyroid hormone, high levels of vitamin D, in order to increase calcium absorption. If lactose is present in my diet, this is a signal to increase the calcium absorption, and lactose typically is going to come from milk products, which also have high levels of calcium. And then if I have food content moving through my gastrointestinal tract at the same time I have calcium in my GI tract, I'm much more likely to absorb that calcium. So basically what that means is if you're taking calcium supplements, take it with food. And then an acidic environment. So you would think that, oh yeah, okay, well the stomach has stomach acid in it and it's a pH of about 2. But that's not always the case with everyone, because there are a lot of people who take antacids and they take what we call proton pump inhibitors. And a proton is a hydrogen ion. Those hydrogen ions are necessary to produce acid. So if I have a person who, let's say, is taking Prilosec, which is a proton pump inhibitor, they're not making as much acid. And so they're going to have a harder time absorbing calcium in their diet, and that can lead to bone issues as well as other issues. Now, calcium absorption is decreased by certain things like phytic acids, oxalates, tannins, which we get a lot of tannins from drinking red wine. Vitamin D deficiency, that's a huge one that we're going to talk about. If somebody has diarrhea, increasing in age, and certain medications. So some of the food sources of calcium, of course, are dairy, like milk, yogurts, and cheese. Dairy products provide about 75% of calcium sources for North Americans. Non-dairy would include dark green leafy vegetables, almonds, legumes, sardines, canned salmon, fortified juices. All right, so North Americans don't eat a lot of deep green leafy vegetables, so that's a problem. Sardines, canned salmon, we're not really big on that either. So this is just some other food sources, like, for instance, raisin bran. 100% of your 1,000 milligrams you can get in 1 cup of raisin bran. That's pretty amazing. Look down here, tofu, yogurt, very good in giving us calcium. Orange juice, because we fortify the orange juice with calcium. We add calcium to it. Calcium supplementation, good or bad? Okay, so one study found that supplemental intake of calcium at the recommended level is not related to higher bone mineral density of the hip or lumbar spine, which is what they measured, compared to lower intake of calcium in elderly men and women in the United States. Okay, so let me say that again. Supplemental calcium, just at the recommended dose, wasn't related to higher bone mineral density. Okay? It didn't do anything. A second study showed an increased risk of heart attack in older adults using calcium supplements. So it's recommending that you keep to 500 milligrams or less per day if you are going to supplement. And there's 2 types of calcium you can purchase, one called calcium carbonate and the other called calcium citrate. Calcium carbonate is 40% calcium, but take it with food. It can make you very sick to your stomach. Calcium citrate is 21% calcium, but you don't have to take it with food. It doesn't cause irritation to the stomach. But it's kind of interesting looking at this and going, okay, so we've been told you got to make sure you take plenty of calcium. That calcium is super important. Make sure you supplement with calcium so that you can have nice healthy bones. But now these studies are saying, might not be true. So what the heck do we do? All right, so calcium supplements, this is just showing you a little bit about the calcium carbonate and citrate. By the way, the carbonate can come in tablets, chewables, Calcium citrate is usually just a pill or liquid, but it's much easier to tolerate for a lot of people. A lot of people can't handle calcium carbonate at all. Even though calcium citrate is a little bit more expensive, it seems to work a little bit better. Calcium carbonate does require a lot of acid in the stomach, whereas if you have a person who isn't producing as much stomach acid, you might recommend calcium citrate in their diet. All right, so let's talk about phosphorus, and then we're going to come back to that question about what the heck do we do as far as calcium supplements are concerned, okay? So we talked already that phosphorus is a component of hydroxyapatite, and it's part of our DNA, it's part of our RNA, it's part of cellular replication, it's part of teeth as well as bones. It helps to make ATP, adenosine triphosphate, for energy. It allows enzymes and vitamin B to function. It's part of our phospholipid bilayer, helps to maintain pH and fluid balance. It does a lot of things in our body. So in order to get enough phosphorus in a day, the recommended daily allowance is 700 milligrams for men and women. However, if you're under the age of 18, between 9 to 18 is 1,250 milligrams. Absorption of phosphorus, just like calcium, is enhanced by the presence of vitamin D, and the average daily consumption is more than we need, 1,000 to 1,600 milligrams. It's pretty efficiently absorbed by our bodies, but it may be a problem in like preterm infants and people who are vegan because they may not eat the right diet to get enough phosphorus, and people who have alcoholism. The tannins are an issue also in absorbing phosphorus. Older people on nutrient-poor diets may not have enough, and people with long-term bouts of diarrhea. By the way, people who also have alcoholism may not just period eat enough food, so they might not get enough phosphorus in their diet. Food sources of phosphorus, milks, cheese, meat, bread, nuts, fish, cereals, eggs. 55 to 80% of the phosphorus we eat is typically absorbed. So here's just some, again, like yogurt is very good. Trail mix, chocolate nut seeds, okay, Raisin Bran, still quite a bit. Fat-free milk, almonds, salmon, making me hungry. You don't want too much phosphorus in your diet. The upper limit is 3 to 4 grams per day, and that high intake can increase calcification of tissues and form stones, so kidney stones. Chronic imbalance of phosphorus to calcium ratio can increase the risk of low bone mineral density. So if I have too much phosphorus in my diet, it actually prevents calcium from being absorbed into the bone, which is obviously a big deal. All right, so vitamin D. This is a fat-soluble vitamin along with A, E, and K, and it is produced in the skin when we're out in ultraviolet light, okay? So usually they say about 20 minutes in the sun is enough to start producing vitamin D. Vitamin D, the precursor to this is cholesterol. And the interesting thing about vitamin D is it's actually a hormone. It's not even really a vitamin, it's a hormone. And there's kind of been a movement to say, okay, let's not call this a vitamin anymore, let's just call this a hormone. Now, activation of vitamin D is going to occur in the liver and the kidneys, and we'll talk about how that happens. There's a couple different forms of vitamin D. So there's actually vitamin D2 and vitamin D3. And what I'm going to tell you is if you go to the store to buy a vitamin D supplement, buy vitamin D3, and I'll show you why in a little bit. But vitamin D2 is called ergocalciferol. It is synthetic, and it's derived from irradiation of plant sterols called ergosterol. And then we put that into vitamin supplements. Vitamin D3 is what we use to fortify our foods. All right, so for the synthesis of vitamin D, The sun is going to hit the skin, and we're going to have 7-dehydrocholesterol converted into vitamin D3, which is cholecalciferol. Then that cholecalciferol is needing to be activated in order to be the active hormone form. And so it's going to be transferred to the liver, where it's going to become 25-hydroxy vitamin D3. And then to the kidney, where it's going to become 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D3, which is the active hormonal form of this vitamin. So this just goes through all of that again. And we know that vitamin D is going to help to regulate blood calcium levels, although it does a whole bunch more than that, which we'll talk about as well. And in the intestines, it's going to increase production of calcium-absorbing proteins in the small intestine so that we have the ability to get more calcium into the bloodstream. And then it also decreases calcium excretion with the help of parathyroid hormone from the kidneys. And then with the help of parathyroid hormone, it increases osteoclast activity, causing calcium to come from the bone into the bloodstream. So vitamin D is going to function to maintain calcium and phosphorus levels in the blood, but again, it has a ton of other things it does in the body, like for instance, it helps with gene expression and cell growth, neuromuscular and immune function. Now, let me just stop for a second and let you know that vitamin D is very important in a healthy immune system. As a matter of fact, there have been some scientific studies to show that if you don't have enough vitamin D, this can help to trigger autoimmune diseases in the body. So having the right amount of vitamin D is very necessary for that immune system to function normally. It helps in reduction of inflammation, and it binds to and affects cells of the immune system, the nervous system, the skin, muscles, reproductive organs, controls growth of the parathyroid gland, and may even decrease risk of certain types of cancers. So it does a lot. It's very important. So the amount of sun exposure you get is going to affect how much vitamin D you have, and that also is dependent on a few things, like for instance your skin color. So the darker your skin, the more melanin you have in the skin. And what melanin is let's say I have a skin cell. Melanin is like a little umbrella over top of that skin cell, and it prevents the ultraviolet light from striking that skin cell, which is a good thing in that it would decrease the risk of that ultraviolet light causing mutations in the DNA of that cell, leading to skin cancer. But it's not a good thing because it decreases the ability for the body to then activate the vitamin D3. With age, that activation also decreases. And then the time of day as well as the latitude that a person lives at. So the more northern the latitude, the less amount of sun someone is going to get in a day depending on the time of the year. So you go to Alaska and you get basically 6 months of daylight, but you also get 6 months of darkness. So this can be a big issue. And then how much exposure are you getting to the sun? So for instance, living in the high desert in California, you would think, oh wow, you get a lot of sunlight, but the high desert is a kind of unique area. It gets really cold and it gets really hot. So nobody wants to go outside except for a short period of time during the year. And so people have a tendency not to be exposed to the sun quite as much as, let's say, if somebody lived in San Diego, California, where it isn't so hot or so cold, and it's easier to stay out in the sun for longer periods of time. So this is just showing you northern hemisphere above the 42nd parallel, that the way that the earth tilts, part of the time you might get a lot of sun, but part of the time you might not get much sun. So factors that impair vitamin D status: limited exposure to UVB light especially reduces your ability to synthesize vitamin D, and we talked about the northern latitudes. But what kind of clothing do you wear? Are you wearing a veil all the time, or are you exposing your limbs to the sunshine? How much smog is in the air? Are you wearing sunscreen above an SPF of 8? And that's not very much when they tell you to wear an SPF of like 5,000 nowadays. And excessive time spent indoors. Then as you age, you aren't able to activate the vitamin D underneath the skin or in the kidneys as much. If you have darker skin because of that melanin. And then how much vitamin D do you intake in your food every day? Do you eat things that are fortified with vitamin D? Do you take a vitamin D supplement, and so on? Exclusive breastfeeding infants. So infants who are not eating anything except for breast milk may have lower vitamin D levels, because also remember, those infants typically are not out in the sun. They're not being exposed to the sun, so you have to be careful of that. And then if people have fat malabsorption, because remember, vitamin D is a fat soluble vitamin. So if I have some kind of liver disease, or I have let's say celiac disease, where I have a lot of diarrhea and fat malabsorption occurs, I cannot absorb the vitamin D through the wall of the small intestines. Obesity, release of vitamin D stored in subcutaneous fat is not efficient. And so the more fat I have on my body, the more I store away my fat-soluble vitamins. And then if I have liver disease or kidney disease, I might not be able to activate that vitamin D3 to get the active hormonal form. So again, deficiencies due to dark-skinned people, low vitamin D in my diet, exclusively breastfed infants, the elderly, and insufficient sun exposure, and then I'm not eating any fortified foods with vitamin D. Now, these deficiencies can lead to something called osteomalacia, which are soft bones. Now, osteomalacia is actually adult onset rickets, and you can kind of see in this picture here with this boy, he has rickets, which is what we would call osteomalacia in children, okay? And his bones are soft, so you can see how they curve. Almost looks like he's been riding a horse all his life. What that is that the weight of his body, and due to gravity, his bones being soft, they bow outward, and that happens with other bones. Depending on the way that use occurs in that person's life, the bones may twist also. And this is due to insufficient intake of calcium, inefficient calcium absorption in the intestines. And remember, you have to have vitamin D in order to be able to absorb calcium. And then the kidneys may be excreting more vitamin D than, or excuse me, more calcium than we need to have excreted. We don't see a lot of rickets or osteomalacia in the United States because we fortify so many things with vitamin D. Basically, all our dairy products are fortified with vitamin D. We used to have a huge rickets problem in the United States. And even when I was younger, I know that's eons ago, but you would see people who had rickets. And it was not good. And it's not just that they're legs are bowed or their arms are bowed, they're also in a lot of pain. It's a very, very painful disease. So making sure we get enough vitamin D is important. Now, the recommended daily allowance is 600 units a day, which is about 15 micrograms. But I will tell you that there are a lot of scientists who say that consuming 2,000 units a day is really what is necessary. So you have to kind of look up the science to see what your patient needs. So some experts suggest 25 micrograms for people who are 70 and over, 20 micrograms, so it's for every 10 micrograms it's 400 units, okay? 20 micrograms would be 800 units for 71 and plus. And so 1 cup of milk is 100 units of vitamin D. And the American Pediatric Society recommends 400 units per day for children and adolescents, with less than 400 units per day intake exclusively breastfed infants, and these are the infants that are getting no sun exposure as well. And just some of the sources of vitamin D, like salmon and sardines, fortified dairy foods, fortified breakfast cereals, mushrooms. These are the only vegetables to contain ergosterol, which is the precursor to vitamin D, and they have the ability to make vitamin D when exposed to ultraviolet light. Some brands are now grown in ultraviolet light so that it can stimulate vitamin D production, which is kind of cool. Here's some other sources of vitamin D. So look at that. Salmon, super duper high in vitamin D. White bread, blackberries, although they're good, no vitamin D. Kiwi, none. Butter, very little. But Raisin Bran again, because it's fortified with vitamin D. Same thing with orange juice, fortified with calcium, fortified with vitamin D. A lot of times what you'll see is products in the United States, if they have calcium in it, we also fortify that product with vitamin D so that the calcium can be absorbed. Avoiding too much vitamin D, you don't want to have what is called hypervitaminosis, okay? You don't want to have too much of this. And the upper limit is 1,000 units per day. Now, of course, people's doctors might prescribe, let's say, 10,000 units of vitamin D for 5 days in a row. And this would be somebody who has very severe deficiencies of vitamin D. But those 10,000 units are typically not consumed for more than a particular period of time, and then they stop taking that, because high levels of vitamin D for long periods of time can become toxic to the system. And although it's not likely to kill you, it can make you feel pretty bad, and you have weakness, loss of appetite, diarrhea, vomiting, confusion, increased urine output. And then toxicity does not occur from sun exposure. All right, so in the next video, we'll talk about magnesium functions. So hang in there and look for part 2.